I hope this doesn't embarrass, but I was taken aback when I learned that this vigorous gentleman with whom I'd had several conversations, there's a vitality in him, and he runs regularly and is just full of life. And he told me that he is turning 81.
I am 81.
Correction, he just announced he is 81. 81 is the new 71, or maybe the new 61 when we have Dr. Esposito. Dr. Dalia Fahmy comes to us from the Long Island University in New York, and young as she is working on book number 4, and she has just received the chair of International Relations and Diplomacy. That's not even in your program. This is late-breaking news. We're very proud of her, and that simply recognizes her accomplishment and her abilities, and the fact that she will, through a long career ahead of her, continue to be, in her way, out in front as an imam. Well, those are our introductions, and we are going to simply make 2 quick comments. For those who wish to know, down the hall we have a prayer room set aside for Salah. For those who wish to partake of it, it's down the hall, and you may do so at any time throughout the day. And a final reminder that this session, all sessions, are being broadcast live. And so be aware in terms of attentive listening and silence, which was wonderful yesterday. We have that again today. So without further ado, Dr. Imam Esposito.
Thank you very much. I prefer Don, as in in Southeast Asia, I'm actually known as the Don of the Temple Mafia, because of all of the people who studied Islamic studies there. I was the first PhD. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Grant Underwood for an incredible job. We've had so many conversations in his planning that it's really clear. I mean, he's meticulous in planning for it. And also those that helped do that and those that have taken care of us here, in particular Jim Taranto, who managed to get me home last night. Not because I was drinking, but because these shoes sort of slip on snow. I want to embellish on Jack. What is Jack Brown's name again? Jack Brown, yes, my colleague, who commented that I'm often on planes. I just passed 3 million miles. So I'm actually about 51, but it's what it does to the body. I'm going to begin doing something that normally I don't do, and that is I want to be briefly autobiographical because it has to do with the way in which I want to indicate how Islam was being viewed when I was in graduate school in America, and then what happened when the Iranian Revolution came, etc. I was born and raised in an Italian Catholic neighborhood in Brooklyn. I left Paradise at 14 and entered the Capuchin Franciscan Fathers, and left the monastery at 24. I was not ordained, okay, just to make that point. I particularly have to do that with Catholic audiences. But that affected very much my view of the world. It was cosmopolitan New York, but actually I was in an Italian neighborhood, and as far as I could walk as a kid, it was all Italian neighborhoods. And it was totally Roman Catholic upbringing all through my master's degree. I became a Vatican II young theologian and taught at a women's Catholic college, and then went to Temple University in order to take a PhD in Catholic studies. It was the only university that was unique about it. It was a department of religion that was founded that dealt with all of the world's religions. So you majored in one religion, you minored in 2. And I was able to do a PhD in Catholic studies, whereas normally I'd have to go to a Catholic university, and I didn't want to do that at the time. I knew nothing about Arabs and Muslims. I had seen The Exodus, the movie, and the book I had read by, I think it was Leon Uris, And I thought that he was a historian of some, and the way he portrayed Arabs and Muslims didn't really make me want to even think about doing anything in it. But the department chairman, because I was in a track for Hinduism and Buddhism at that point, Zen Buddhism, suggested I take a course on Islam, and I declined. He suggested a second meeting. I declined. And a third meeting, a very soft-spoken guy sort of blew up and said, "What is it with you Catholics?" And his problem was that it was just at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, when many of us were leaving monasteries and nunneries, etc., and we're very involved, many of them, in the student union. And we're rather vocal with what they wanted. But he basically said that we were hiring a Muslim scholar, Ismail al-Faruqi, and I ought to do a course with him. Faruqi had written a book on Christian ethics, and he said, you two could vibe. I went to see Faruqi, and Faruqi said, "Well, let's plan your course of studies." I said, no, I'm only doing one course. About a month later, he called me into his office and said, University of Pennsylvania has a crash course in the summertime in Arabic. You really should take it. I said, "Well, why would I take Arabic?" He said, "In order to do Islamic studies." I said, "But if I'm not doing Islamic studies, why would I take Arabic?" He said, "Please sign it." So I signed it, figuring I'd never get it. I got it, and they paid me money in the summertime, and I decided it would be a good conversation at cocktail parties in the future. For whatever reason, Faruqi opened up a vision for me. He was my mentor. He and his wife were murdered at a certain point. And so I'm sorry. I am the stereotype of an emotional Italian. So don't ask me about my wife. Okay. But I suddenly discovered in his course that the way the world was constructed in those days was that Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam were all on one side, and Judaism and Christianity were on the other when it came to studying religion. So Islam had no connection there. And I looked, and what I saw was a kind of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition as far as I was concerned, which, by the way, when some of us began to write about that, became very controversial in terms of people being upset. But I won't go into why I can say Judeo-Christian Islamic, because other speakers have. But the recognition that Muslims have of previous revelations in the Torah, in the Gospels, and of Jesus and Mary, of the biblical prophets, etc. And so that fascinated me. But the question really became, why would I do Islam? Because as my colleagues said, who were all young Catholic theologians, you'll never get a job. There'll always be Catholic universities, so if there are cuts or whatever, there are always going to be job positions. And as another said, why would you go into that abracadabra field, which was very much the mentality at that time. Why? If you looked at America in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a country of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. And there was a famous book that was written with that title. And the reason why Catholics were there was he was signaling in the study that we had finally arrived. So then rather than just talking about Judaism, Christianity, you had Catholics. But Muslims were invisible in America. It doesn't mean that they weren't Muslims, but they were seen as Lebanese or Egyptian, etc. Mosques were very invisible. One of the oldest was in Iowa. I often say to my Muslim friends when I went to Iowa, why'd your family come to Iowa? But anyway, and the other was the Boston Mosque, which wasn't in Boston, but was in Quincy, Mass, where most people didn't know how to get there. So Islam was invisible. It was invisible in a variety of ways in our educational system. Very few colleges and universities had courses in Islam. Primary and secondary school, no coverage. Today I have students who come in the first year of university, and many of them have taken world religions courses or even courses on Islam. I have a number of them that started studying Arabic in high school, completely different. Diplomats were not trained in the importance of knowing the areas of politics and culture and religion. When I went to Georgetown, I was able to take one of the titles. They told me I could take a title. I said, I don't think it would fit because you probably have a lot of people with the title Professor of Religion and International Affairs, because Georgetown is a school of international affairs. And they had no one. So it was invisible in the professional organizations, in the Middle East Studies Association. The American Academy of Religion had no coverage of Islam until Ismail al-Faruqi and some of his grad students in the end of the 70s petitioned. And then we had to be kind of tested over a couple of years in terms of was there, a constituency so that you'd have a permanent representation. And that didn't happen until the early to mid 1980s. With regard to our diplomats, our foreign service officers, it wasn't until around 1983, 1984, the Foreign Service Institute began to have speakers on Islam in the Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And I used to do a fair amount of that in those days. Everything changed with the Iranian Revolution. Everything. Because before that, I could send out book contracts and get no answers. Or what happened was I sent out, I think it was like 50 publishers, and only 2 answered and said, great idea, no market. The Iranian Revolution came along, and I signed 3 book contracts in 5 weeks. And the reason was there weren't many people who were specialists. Most people were in a panic. The thing that saved a lot of people was that we had answering machines. So when New York Times would call, for many people, if they asked them about Shia Islam, not a clue. Even people that did degrees in Islamic studies, many of them really didn't do much with Shia Islam. There, all kinds of areas were really absent in terms of their representation there. But suddenly everybody was scrambling. Media, government, all wanted to be briefed, wanted to talk to people, and so that brings me to the final point of my biography. I quite literally say all the time, I owe my career and my first Lexus to Ayatollah Khomeini. I owe my Lexus coupe to somebody else, but I don't refer to the somebody else. But it really showed the market kind of approach and the market run. But what it really did also say is, where were we to understand anything? Tom Brokaw on the Today Show, when they were at the gate where the hostages were taken, he interrupted to say, let me tell you something about Islam. It's the 2nd largest of the world's religions. It has a book, the Quran, and a prophet named Muhammad. And that's all he said. But imagine the presumption in an educated America, that was the state we were in. And yet most Americans, if they went any place in the world, would expect that people would have heard the word Jesus, Bible, maybe Catholic. It's the level of not having any background, and then engaging Muslims by watching TV and seeing people in the streets of Tehran yelling death to America. It seems very empirical to people. Where do you go from there in terms of dealing with it? And so, in fact, it was the Iranian Revolution that was the lens through which many in the West came to see Islam and Muslims. And that became a dominant kind of coverage. Edward Said, a prominent scholar, as well as a public intellectual when it came to the Middle East, from Columbia in 1981, right after the Iranian Revolution, he wrote the following: for the general public in America and Europe today, Islam is news of a particularly unpleasant sort. The media, government, the geopolitical strategists, and academic experts on Islam are all in concert saying, quote, Islam is a threat to Western civilization. What I am saying, Said said, is that negative images of Islam are very much more prevalent than any others, and that such images correspond not with Islam, with what Islam is, but to what prominent sectors of a particular society take it to be. Islam in the West, he said, a clash of civilizations. Those sectors have the power and the will to propagate their particular image of Islam. This image, therefore, becomes more prevalent, more present than all others. And I should note, Edward Said was an Arab Christian, not an Arab Muslim. By the 1990s, 10 years later, many people missed it, that Said had said this. 2 prominent academics who also had access to government and were looked to by government. Bernard Lewis in a piece called Roots of Muslim Rage, and then Sam Huntington with his article, The Clash of Civilizations. And that really stuck in. And Sam, who had a great publication record, that was the biggest book that he ever had. People wanted him all over the world. Muslim friends from Malaysia and stuff would ask if I could get him to go there. But in his first article, he talked about the fact that Islam had bloody borders. Not Muslim countries have bloody borders, but Islam has bloody borders. And in the book, he added, Islam has bloody innards, bloody innards. And on a TV program that I did with him, when he was asked to explain why he kept the former and then added the latter, he declined to respond. So there was a real difference. The next part I'm going to say has been cut out by my wife, but Grant said I can go a little over 30 minutes. I'll be going till about lunchtime, so just sit back and relax. The reality was, he and I did a debate in Saudi Arabia, and I didn't know him. He called me in my home as if we knew each other and said, "Are you going?" And we went. And as we were walking into this debate, and the debate was in Saudi Arabia, and you had a huge auditorium that held thousands of people, males, and then one next to it that had females. The guy who put it together ran up to me and said, "Please talk to Professor. He's going to talk about Islam and modernization and development theory. You know, the reason we invited him is to address the clash of civilizations." And indeed, there was a clash, within the audience. And it was an interesting clash because the man that really challenged him was a German who was the ambassador to North Africa and converted to Islam, and who was a Harvard graduate as well, and who really challenged him on this issue. But in those days, clash just caught and people bought into it. Islam came to be seen as a triple threat: historical, geographic, and demographic, meaning population. I have to tell you, I didn't know what demographic was. I have a limited vocabulary, having been raised in Brooklyn. Now, I remember when I first saw the word, I thought, who do I ask? I can't ask colleagues, because they'll wonder, you don't know what the hell that is, what the word means? Fortunately, my wife had been an English major, so she helped me. But the triple threat was out there, and it was clear. The Assistant Secretary of State, or one of them, asked to see me. And it was the very day when, about 2 hours before, I had signed a contract to write a book called The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality. And what he said to me is, I don't see Islam as a threat, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, I can see where global Islamic fundamentalism can be a threat. And he said, will Algeria be another Iran? And of course, I had to explain that A, enormous population difference; B, Islamically completely different; C, big difference in terms of wealth, military, etc. But the idea of even raising them to the same level. And that was very much where we were coming from. It was at that time that I was invited to Georgetown to start a center called the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And the donors were Arab, Christian, and Arab Muslim businessmen from the Gulf, and their concern was that there might be an Islamic threat. Now I tell you something that is supposedly literally true. The donor went to Kramer's bookstore, and his assistant pulled a book off the shelf, and it was my book, Islamic Threat. So he recommended me to the president, as it turned out. I call it a spirit-driven moment for him. So what did 9/11 really do? It ratcheted up and made global the reality of this threat. It reinforced the threat, that there was a global threat. It was a brilliant move by bin Laden to decide to attack the two major identifiers, as it were, the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And so I'm told, or have been told, the intention was also to hit. And of course, last January 6th, we had some people who actually attempted that. But the reality of it is that he planned it that way. He planned it that way. And then subsequent to that, you had many similar attacks in London, in Spain, in Madrid, in Bali. So again, you get this wave, and finally you're getting the media coverage of it, and I'll have something to say about that. The media then catches on, and that really explodes and makes everything work out. Now, the thing, in all fairness to George W. Bush, on the one hand, I'll also do on the other hand, yes, he declared a global war on terrorism, and we can discuss that off this panel because that's not what we're about. But he went out of his way to say that there was a difference between, if you will, mainstream Islam and what these militants were doing. and that he wanted that distinction. And he said Islam is a religion of peace, and Al-Qaeda and their terrorists are doing their extreme things. But it then did become a problem when he used the word crusades. Some of you are old enough to remember that then he backed off that. He didn't realize that word would be a problem. And the Pentagon used the word infinite justice for some of what it was doing, which, created also, fed the problem that we had. But creating that phrase, global war on terrorism, in terms of the way in which people would see it, because I remember that the day when he talked about it, he was did a public announcement, and he had all this chief military, and I did a Fox News interview. And so the woman after it, she was asking me about the Muslim world, and I said, well, you really have to be careful about what countries you want to talk about and stuff. And she said, are you deaf? I've never had anybody talk to me that way. I said, excuse me, are you deaf? Did you just hear what he said? This is a global war on terrorism. We will go any place in the world where this is occurring. And of course, as you'll remember, we just had the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq, etc. I remember doing a consulting job with British military, and they were very supportive. As you know, Blair was very supportive of Mr. Trump. But the chief presenter said, I wish the phrase global war wasn't used. There's no boundary to it, and how do you declare an end? What does it mean to declare an end? And I think that really stays there. At the same time, in a differing way from the UK, as my colleague Asma said the other day, where Running Mead had used the word Islamophobia in the UK, Islamophobia was not used in the United States until the year 2010. And that was the so-called mosque at ground zero, neither a mosque nor a ground zero. And people miss that. It was also based and very much inspired by the Jewish Y on 92nd Street, which means it was not only something for the community, but for the broader community. And it was tied into luxury apartments. But that didn't matter, and it was approved by the government. But you had people like Pamela Geller and Robert Spencer and others who are card-carrying Islamophobes who turned it into a national demonstration, etc. And that is what then led to an article at the time in Time magazine. The cover story was, is America Islamophobic? And the author went to an area in America, interviewed, etc., and basically the conclusion was that it is. And I remember doing interviews on CNN. CNN would bring you in and have you there for an hour or two and do segments so they could use it over a period of time. But what struck me was this very intelligent newscaster and her producer during the break said to me, what is this, what's happening? And I said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. In other words, the existence of Islamophobia had been there in America for quite a while. So what is Islamophobia? This is the definition that I have here, comes from bridge.georgetown.edu. If you want information on Islamophobia globally, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. It's the bridge protecting pluralism, ending Islamophobia. And we have 1.1 followers on Facebook. I'm thinking of pulling us off Facebook, but my ego can't let go of it. Then we'll be down to 0, so I don't think I can quite do that. But the reality of Islamophobia is, and the way we would define it is, it's anti-Muslim attitudes and behaviors, an extreme fear and a hostility towards Islam and Muslim, an extreme fear, that's where the phobia fits in, towards Islam and Muslims, that often leads to hate speech, hate crimes, social and political discrimination. So it covers the kind of bases. It doesn't mean that you can't be critical about Islam and Muslims. So that's not the point. You can be critical about any religious tradition. We have freedom of speech, etc. It's that bias that's there that becomes an issue. The link between America's lack of familiarity about Islam and Muslims and negative views of the religion and people were documented in major polls. I'm going to refer to the Gallup poll a few times, and professionally, I'm supposed to say that I was a Gallup senior scientist. I was associated with it. I never knew what the heck the phrase senior scientist, but it was a nice title. You collect titles the older you get. It's kind of nice. I have other titles that are crude, but That has to do with people that don't like me. I forget this is being recorded, okay. That means when my wife sees it, we'll have a long conversation. The Gallup World Poll was a poll that was run from 2001 to 2007. It looked at the whole world, and it was about quality of life. Are you happy in your life? Do you feel economically secure? Do you feel... But it also did 35 to 40 Muslim countries and asked questions that were pertinent to Muslims. And also, Time Magazine and the New York Times in 2010 both reported that when the US respondents were asked what they admire about the Muslim world, 55% said nothing or I don't know. A majority did not know a Muslim. 33% disclosed that they believe that American Muslims were more sympathetic to terrorism. And 60% had negative feelings about Muslims. What does negative feelings mean? 49% of Americans believe that US Muslims were not loyal to the US. And Islam, this is the interesting thing, Islam was viewed even worse than Muslims were. People have this funny way of not being able to deal with, if you're dealing with the reality of things, saying Muslims do that. Islam can't do things, you know. But we'll see later on that somebody talked about Islam hates us. So Islam was viewed even more negatively. 59% of Americans said they had unfavorable views of the faith. You can bet that most of them knew nothing about the faith. I mean, you know, that is, given the state of where we were at that time. I mean, what they would know is maybe what they got from television, you know, or social media, but it wouldn't be as if they were people who had actually read something, you know, and really, you know, seriously approached it. 44% said Muslims are too extreme in their religious beliefs, which for me gets really interesting when you're dealing with other faiths. You know, there was a case in Boston in which a group, a religious group, but not one of the major world religions, was being seen as extremist and not scientific. And an ex-Jesuit was the lawyer for the defense. And he basically said to the judge, now this is in Boston, very Catholic, he said, you know, there's this other group too. He said, there's this religious group that believes that you can take bread and wine and change it into the very body and blood of Jesus Christ. And the judge dismissed the case. Okay. All right, now let's think about media. Again, Asma referred to some really good media spots, but there's one outfit that I deal with that I think has some interesting things to say. It's called Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R. And you can find a lot of this information, again, at Bridge, or if you look up Media Tenor's website. But here's what they did that was very different. They looked at 975,000 pieces. 975,000 pieces of American and European media. In 2001, they looked at it, and then in 2011. In 2001, when they looked at all this media and said, where are Islam and Muslims, they found that 2% of all the news about them in the Western media presented images of Muslim militants. And when it came to the vast majority of Muslims and coverage, 0.1%. So 2%, 0.1%. 2011, the 2% goes up to 25%. And one could say, well, the numbers, you know, there's a reason for an increase. There was a lot of terrorist actions. But the coverage of mainstream Muslims remained at 0.1%. 2015, it gets worse. 2015, the report that came out in 2016, but it was done in 2015, the interviews, was that Islamophobia has become normalized internationally. Why? 8 out of 10 stories, for example, in US, UK, and Germany were about militants and terrorists. Even those on mainstream Muslims, many of them, about 50%, equivocated. And when they talked about individual Muslims, now you would think they'd talk about maybe a Muslim terrorist, but they'd also talk about a Muslim that won some international awards, etc. No, it was all militants that were portrayed. I had cut out a reference to the New York Times, But again, if you're interested, it should be on Bridge, or you can write to me. A study of the New York Times over a 25-year period found that Islam was seen as more negative than the stories and coverage of the cocaine and a variety of other things that we would normally see as absolutely negative. So that's the reality on the ground that most people aren't aware of. Media Tenor brought out a study in 2020 that basically said things had not changed significantly. When you look at media coverage, now things have changed significantly on the ground. In some ways in the US things have gotten better, but they've also gotten a bit worse. In Europe things have gotten worse, and I'll make some mention to that. Asma referred to the organized Islamophobia network. When you look at the report that was done, the progress report called Fear, Inc., you were talking about $42.6 million going towards these outfits, okay? And that's based on IRS returns. But a study done in 2016 by CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, but also UC Berkeley Center for Race and Gender, issued a broader report that concluded that between 2008 and 2013, $205 million supported these kinds of websites and individual writers. 205 million. There's no alternative on social media presenting a different position. Bridge does not have $205 million. But I know that the LDS community is a successful community, and I'd be very happy. Just see me after I take a check, credit card, whatever you have. How has Islamophobia affected American elections? Reference was made to Obama's situation. But the interesting about Obama was not just the birth thing, that Mr. Trump was the main person putting it out. Also, he questioned his excellence at Harvard, and basically said if you really look into it, his record wasn't that good. And so even though he made the Harvard Law Review, which is prestigious, it was, et cetera. But more than that, when Obama was in the Detroit area, where you have one of the largest Muslim groups, they were doing a photo op with young people, and most of them, I think half of them were not hijab, and then a couple of them had a hijab on. Obama's people kind of eased and set up the photo op so that they wouldn't be seen. Also, Obama, who gave this incredible speech from Cairo about Islam and Muslims, etc., never went to a mosque in America until the very end of his term. He was in for 8 years, the very end. He went to a mosque in Turkey. I was there with him when he was there by coincidence. He went to a mosque in Cairo, but he did not, no photo op at, that really says something, because that's not the nature of President Obama. It was the reality of the political situation. When we move to recent elections, we find that in 2016, 2/3 of people in a poll reported, and it happens to be Mr. Trump's supporters, that they believe that Obama is still a Muslim, that Obama is a Muslim. And I think it's his name, that goes that way, obviously, but that says the way we're kind of thinking. As a candidate, Mr. Trump advocated a temporary freeze on all foreign Muslim immigration, as well as monitoring or even the forced closure of American mosques. The result? His polls soared. A Republican friend of mine who's a Muslim and very much involved in the Republican Party, told me about a particular senator whose name I won't mention, a congressman. But anyway, he talked about him. He said, he gives this speech every now and then. And he said, in fact, it's when he needs funding. And he was from the New York area. And the funding goes up. So there are a lot of realities that feed this situation. When Anderson Cooper asked about Islam and how the president saw Islam, the president basically said, Islam is at war with the West. I think Islam hates us. There's a tremendous hatred, and we cannot allow people coming into the country who have that hatred. Now, there are Muslims that have a hatred, but they are a fraction of a fraction. It's not the whole group. So we're generalizing about the group. It's not the same as, but as an Italian American growing up at the time of the mafia, it was very common for people to think, and I came from Brooklyn, that I had connections to mafia or that I knew a lot of mafia people. Even when I was in the monastery, people who were devout Catholics, but of different ethnic groups, one in particular, and so that ethnic group is not going to be mentioned tonight, they thought it was just funny to do mafia jokes, but also talk as if I really, knew mafia, that kind of sort of generalization. So when you say Islam hates us and your audience hears that, they don't focus on, it's much better to just denounce ISIS and AQ, etc. They think there's something particularly about this religion. If you look at the body count historically, of violence done in the name of religion between Islam and Christians, Christians score very well historically. So, this is part of the reality that we deal with, especially when we're dealing with the average person who's busy every day. They work, they have a family, etc. And then depending on what news outlet they have, and especially if they don't look at multiple news outlets, it's almost natural that you're going to have that situation. So what about American Muslims? And here I'll move to my conclusion. When I'm in an audience, I look and say, holy jeez, he's over time. American Muslims and Muslims in Europe, the great thing about being up here is he can't drag me off the stage. He won't dare. He gave my age. It'll look like he's really taking advantage of me. But who are these Muslims? What do we know about them? There he is. I think I'm being discriminated against because of my sex. I won't play on that word. The reality of it is Muslims are integral, and I love talking about the mosaic, because it used to be the melting pot routine. And the melting pot means we all become one, but what in fact, even is that one? But of this mosaic, and we look at the data, what are the facts that we have? And this is data, by the way, is over the last 10 years. It's not just yesterday. So I pulled it off Gallup, Pew, and an outfit called ISPU. I'll refer to them in a second. In recent years, what we've seen is that American Muslims, the reports are, they are economically, educationally, and socially integrated into the U.S. Economically, educationally, and socially. In fact, some polls, as much as 10 years ago, talk about a significant number of Muslims who make $100,000 or more. Okay? That doesn't mean that there aren't, poor Muslims, etc. 40% have had college degrees versus 29% of other Americans overall. Muslim women are statistically as likely as Muslim men to hold college and postgraduate degrees. This is in contrast to many Muslim countries in terms of access to education. Economically, Muslims are as successful as others who are average Americans. They're diverse professionals, doctors. The largest groups are doctor groups. My wife used to always worry because I do a lot of traveling and speaking. I was going out to Detroit. I wasn't feeling well. I sat there. I have more doctors in an audience if I get sick. And it so happened I didn't feel well. So I just announced, would the doctors in the house raise their hand? So you see all the hands. And then I said, now I'd like those that don't have children to put their hand down. And then I said, and those that have children, would you leave your hand up if your kid is a doctor? And it's incredible. As one father said to me, bragging about his son, he's just wonderful, but I love my daughter. I'm so close to my daughter. And she's a lawyer. And that's okay. That's okay. Okay. They're also blue-collar workers and laborers. I had a Muslim driver who said to me, he's from Pakistan. He said, I work here and I go home to Pakistan for a couple of months. As a result, my wife can have somebody helping in the house, etc. She wants to come to America. I said, you're not going to have the same life. We're going to be in a small apartment, So she comes, and he said to me, Professor, people think that we are overly protective of our women. I tell my wife every day, get a job. Get a job. He said, I've got to get her out of the house. So the reality of it is this broad spectrum economically and professionally Among non-working, 31% have full-time students as compared to 10% of the general population in America. But what about Muslim religious views? Now, here I'm talking about American Muslim religious views, okay? I'm not talking about, Muslims in a particular country. It would be just as with, Christianity. It can vary from country to country, et cetera. 84% strongly emphasize shared values with Christians and Jews. A major Pew survey as in 2011, not just right now, found Muslims held mainstream views. A majority of Muslims believed other faiths can lead to eternal life, as compared to 64% of Christians in terms of their position. Here's the great one. 93% of Muslims have close non-Muslim friends. A majority claim most of their friends are non-Muslim. Now watch this. In contrast, 75% of white Americans reported 91% of their friends are white, and that they had one black friend or one Latino friend or one Asian friend. And I remember in the early days, which given my age, it could be any decade, but I remember talking to Muslim audiences and saying, you'll know when you become part of the mosaic is when you wake up someday and you just say to yourself, who are my friends? And suddenly you realize so many of your friends are not of your faith. The way I sort of put it as a Catholic, and that you weren't even self-conscious of it. It wasn't that you were going out to say, well, I got to, tell Fulan to go and find a Protestant, then go find some LDS friend, and we'll look good in the polls. I mean, the reality of it is that's just the reality of the community, because remember, the community now, in addition to African-American Muslims who've been here for hundreds of years, the American non-African American community are third and fourth generation now. So, they're as American, if not more American than I am. I'm sort of second generation. The Public Religion Research Institute and the Washington Post provided some of that data that I just mentioned to you. Okay, in conclusion, I would be remiss if I didn't mention to you that the situation in France and Austria is terrible in the last year. Muslim civil society is under siege from Macron and his government, and also the situation in Austria. One of my senior researchers, who's a PhD, is a professor, etc., he and 29 other families in Austria had 500 military and security forces in the middle of the night, went to these 30 homes, not all 500 to each home, broke into the house with guns drawn. He asked them when they went to go to the room where his children were, please don't, walk in with your guns drawn. They were drawn. They seized all their electronic equipment. They froze all their bank accounts. They also froze their ability to sell their house. And in Austria, the government has 2 to 3 years to decide whether they're going to indict you, which means if you really want to, I can't use the word I wanted to use. If you really wanted to what? I can't say. Stick it to them rather than screw. Right, okay. Stick it to them. If you really wanted to stick it to them, you don't have to say anything. And then thank God, after all of this happened, and it was really becoming very dangerous, for people in terms of their future, the people in another sector of the Austrian government threw all of that out. But that's where we are. And in France, the situation, they haven't thrown it out. It's a major issue that occurs. And just globally, to finish up, think about the fact that globally, if you look at China, you have more than 1 million Uyghurs who both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have said have been subject to genocide. In Myanmar, you have more than 1 million Rohingya. And in India, where you have 200 million Muslims, there have been incredible cases of discrimination, including talking about COVID jihad, blaming Muslims for COVID, and then discovering that they had to back off that. They also talk about marriage jihad, that Muslims in India or even in other countries are seeking to marry non-Muslims and then also make them become Muslims. So we're looking at a phenomenon in a world in which, in particular when I look at the West, but also in a world overseas, more globally, a world that we would have expected, for some of us here who are old enough and have had a number of decades behind us, that that world was going to get better and be safer and be more pluralistic and be more compassionate, or just social justice. I like social justice better. I happen to like compassion a lot, but when you say compassion, some people, it's a soft topic. But in terms of social justice, and it's gotten worse. So for me, our obligation as citizens, and those of us who are people of faith and no faith, is to really address these issues in any way that we can. In universities, having courses, running programs, for people who have an opportunity to, and can have discussion groups where people get together of different faiths and discuss things, for people who are voters to be very much involved, and certainly in interfaith relations. The good news in interfaith relations is that it's become far more inclusive. I can tell you, I was probably part of the first Muslim, Christian, Jewish dialogue in the United States. That's absurd. Even given my age, that's absurd. You know? And it was at a time also when I was asked to participate in a dialogue, and I said, so what would you like me to talk about? Vatican II? They said, oh no, you're going to be the Muslim. I said, this is in the Boston area. I said, well, can't you find Muslims? They said, yeah, but a lot of them are computer scientists, et cetera, and they don't, you know, they don't do. Now that's changed. But I think that that's really what it seems to me, what our obligation today in the world that we're in today is to build a world where, and certainly in America, a world where we can have our differences and yet see everybody as having an equal right to citizenship, part of the mosaic. Thank you very much.